Although they are not perfect, and even those based on true stories are in many ways fictionalized, historical films are a huge way that people gain interest in history, especially films set during various wars. I've already covered 10 underrated war films set around the actions of British forces, but I thought it only right to expand this by doing a list of underrated international war films. As stated in the previous list, I am not saying that these films are perfect or better than some of their more famous offerings out there, just that I personally find them underrated, and I think they are at least worth a watch on a quiet weekend afternoon with nothing else to do. Set during the Battle of the Bulge, the German surprise offensive into the Ardennes forest in the winter of 1944. Saints and Soldiers follows a small group of US soldiers who escape the infamous Malmedy massacre and find themselves trapped behind enemy lines. They find a shot down British pilot who has vital information on the German advance that needs to reach the Allied lines. The men are forced to make a 20-plus-mile trek through bad weather, constantly hunted by enemy patrols, with little equipment and only two weapons between them. The film is not action-packed, it is a slow burn and far more character-driven than anything else, especially Corporal Nathan Greer, played by Corbin Allred, a former Mormon missionary who is haunted by a tragic mistake he made in combat weeks earlier. Released in 2003, the film has the air of Saving Private Ryan about it. It was very common during the time, and you could say still largely is. Despite its historical inaccuracies, such as main characters being from the 101st Airborne Division, something that is not possible, as they didn't arrive in the Ardennes until the day after the Malmedy massacre, it does well on its modest $780,000 budget. When you think of films set during the disastrous Gallipoli campaign during the First World War, the most famous is of course the film that bears the campaign's name from 1981. A film that was an early starring role for Mel Gibson. But today, we're talking about the often forgotten film from 11 years later, Chinook Bear. The film is the only one I know of that covers the actions of New Zealanders in the Dardanelles. The film itself, as you can guess from its name, covers the battle for the hill known as Chinook Bear in the August of 1915 by men of the Wellington Regiment who took the hill and held it for over 24 hours, with no support or supplies, fighting until they were completely out of water and ammunition, against multiple waves of Turkish troops, with just 54 men left of the original 700 by the end. Made in 1992 by Daybreak Pacific, it stars Robert Powell as Sergeant Major Smith and Kevin Wilson as Colonel Connolly, a fictionalised version of Colonel William Malone, who led the Wellingtons in battle. Based off the play Once on Chinook Bear by Maurice Shadbolt, it tells a simple but gripping story that, despite its shortcomings in budget, most of the film is shot on a soundstage and it shows, manages to pack a punch as well as its more famous counterparts. Now, this might be stretching the term underrated slightly. As with critics, the film was generally well regarded, but it seems over the years it has slightly slipped out of interest of the public when discussions of war films come up. Sam Fuller's The Big Red One is a very ambitious film for its rather meagre, even for 1980, $4 million budget. Beginning with a flashback to the final minutes of the First World War, we spend the majority of the film following a rifle squad in the famed Big Red One, the US 1st Infantry Division during the Second World War, through North Africa, Sicily, France, Belgium, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The film covers 3 amphibious landings, as well as several key battles of the Second World War, and is the only film I know of that depicts the fighting between American forces and Vichy French in North Africa. One thing that makes the Big Red One so interesting is that it is based around the wartime experiences of Fuller, who also wrote the film. He served in the 1st Infantry Division, receiving the Silver and Bronze Stars as well as the Purple Heart, and participated in many of the actions shown in the film. Now, you could either argue this gave him a unique insight when making the film, or that it made him too personally involved and unable to tell a non-biased story. The film is also notable for being among the first film roles for one icon of cinema, as well as among the last for another. The squad sergeant is played by Lee Marvin, himself, like Fuller, a veteran of the Second World War and also wounded in action, and this time with the Marines in the Pacific. And one of the privates, Private Griff, is portrayed by Mark Hamill, with the film opening just 2 months after The Empire Strikes Back. The film is not without its problems. The low budget does show, especially during the D-Day scene, and it does the classic let's just repaint US tanks and call them German ones, something I know some people find it hard to look past. I personally can, depending on when the film was made. Now, I speak purely my own opinion here, but I believe this film is among the cornerstones of the much improved, more realistic films we have today. It walked so others could run, you might say. I will finish off by saying there are two versions of this film available: the theatrical cut and the restoration cut that adds an extra 40 minutes. I recommend the longer version. It can drag a bit in places, and there are some scenes that should have been cut in general, but it tells a much more cohesive story and closer to what Sam Fuller intended to tell. We now move on to what I think is one of the finest uses of a minuscule budget to tell an interesting and engaging war story about a topic that many would say there are very limited storylines you could do with it, even with a decent budget. The Fortress follows the crew of a B-17 bomber named the Lucky Lass, part of the 12th Air Force stationed in Algeria, taking part in bombing raids over Sicily and Italy in 1943. Now, the film does a fairly standard plot. New crew member comes in to replace a well-respected member who was killed in action, and the film depicts him becoming part of the team both in action and during the slow times between missions. But there's some interesting characters along the way and some interesting twists at times. I also bring the film up due to its interesting production, that due to not having the funds to film around a real B-17, they built a one-to-one replica of a flying fortress out of wood to get around this. The use of CGI for establishing shots and aerial battles is less than photogenic to say the least, but on a budget of $325,000, it's more than forgivable in my opinion. And with the Second World War in the air, especially the bomber crews, being largely overlooked in major films for the last 30 years, it is the smaller films such as this that are telling their stories. If you're a fan of 1990s Memphis Belle, and this film has slipped under your radar, you might find The Fortress enjoyable, if not as polished. Two areas of the Second World War that are often covered in film, but rarely put together, is the Pacific and Special Forces. Most films about the war against Japan cover the actions of the US Marines and the US Army in their island hopping campaign pushing towards Japan. And the role of Special Forces is more connected with the European theatre, such as the Cockleshell Heroes and the Heroes of the Telemark. But the work carried out against the Japanese Empire in a similar fashion is largely overlooked. This is where Attack Force Z comes in, based off the real Z Special Unit made up of Australian, New Zealanders, British and Dutch troops. The film follows a team of these men on a mission to rescue a crew of a transport plane shot down on a Japanese-controlled island. Released in 1981, two of the film's leads are played by Mel Gibson and Sam Neill, who, although would both go on to be world famous, at the time were little known outside of Australia and New Zealand. Overall, Attack Force Z is an enjoyable but strange film at times, that isn't quite sure what it wants to be. You will have scenes of mercy killings and torture, alongside scenes of locals fighting off entire groups of Japanese with their bare hands. But, as I've said, it's enjoyable and has some fairly solid action scenes and some fairly decent acting. In my 10 underrated British war films, I cover the film A Hill in Korea, a film about a lost British Army patrol during the retreat of 1951. Today, we return to this conflict, this time for one of the many South Korean produced films about it, 71 Into the Fire, telling the true story of the 71 student soldiers who fought against a large North Korean force of troops made up of the 766th Independent Infantry Regiment. Student soldiers were just as they sound. Students who either volunteered or were conscripted into the South Korean army to fill desperately needed gaps in manpower during the invasion by North Korea. They were all either undertrained or completely untrained, and were active for about a year until enough UN troops had arrived to fight alongside the South Koreans. 71 Into the Fire details the defence of Pohang Girls' School. I apologise, I almost certainly pronounced that wrong. In August 1950, a battle fought to buy time for the main South Korean force to reorganise and prepare to fight the invading North Koreans. I guess you could think of it as a South Korean version of the Alamo. The film is well paced and exciting, but a bit bombastic at times. A lot of slow motion charges and yelling, so maybe the Alamo was a bad comparison. It's more like the South Korean version of 300. All jokes aside, 71 Into the Fire has some great battle scenes and some great performances, especially from the main student soldier, who I only found out while researching this is played by a South Korean pop star, whose name I'm not even going to attempt and butcher here, but he goes by the stage name T.O.P. Staying in Asia for our next film, a film that covers one of the strangest and most overlooked acts of the late 1930s, the story of John Rabe during the Nanking Massacre of 1937. With the aid of other foreigners, he set up the Nanking Safety Zone, saving up to 200,000 Chinese civilians from rampaging Japanese troops. For those who don't know the story, you might be wondering why John is not more known in the West, and the answer is a pretty simple one. He was a member of the Nazi Party, although he was more a member out of convenience than being a true believer in the cause. It was his status as a Nazi Party member, and that he was working officially for Germany, that he was able to utilise the powers he had to challenge the actions of the Japanese authorities and save lives. It's an incredible true story told in this film, a German, French, and Chinese production. It was released in 2009, starring Ulrich Tuger, Daniel Brohl, and Steve Buscemi. I won't go into too much of the plot here, as I don't wish to spoil anything for you. Although once a very popular topic covered in cinema, films about the French Foreign Legion have now fallen out of fashion. 1998's Legionnaire tells a pretty basic story of a boxer in Paris whose pride won't let him take a dive in a match, leaving him on the wrong side of a powerful gang. With nowhere to hide, he is forced to join the French Foreign Legion and is soon shipped off to Morocco to fight in the Rif War. But with the gang hot on his tail, Rif warriors behind any sand dune, and the ranks filled with murderers, crooks, and cutthroats, who can he trust, and how will he survive? Made in the late 90s at the height of his fame, the film is led pretty well by Jean-Claude Van Damme. Now, if you are either interested or normally put off by his general one-man army or kickboxing films, this is not one of those. I think it's one of his more understated films and definitely among his best. But of course, films of this kind are made by their supporting cast. And possibly the most important character to get right in any military-based film is the Sergeant. Legionnaire brings us Sergeant Steenkamp, at times cruel, but when things go wrong, fights just as hard as his men, played to his normal high standard by Steven Berkoff. Legionnaire is by no means deep or particularly thought-provoking, but it is definitely a good film on the entertainment front. Although technically more a docudrama than a full film, but all the storylines play out without interruption, so I'm going to class it as one, because this film desperately needs more attention in my opinion. Storming Juno covers just that, the fighting for and around Juno Beach by Canadian forces on D-Day. The film tells three stories, of the men landing on the beach on foot, the rarely featured in film armour support, and Canadian paratroopers fighting behind the German front lines. As I have said for many on this list, it was clearly filmed on a very low budget, although the funds they did have seem to have been spent on the right things, getting weapons and uniforms to look right, at least at a glance. I'm sure those more knowledgeable than myself could point out problems with them. Although released in 2010, Storming Juno doesn't seem to have much of a fan base. Give it a watch if you are interested on seeing how things played out on D-Day on a beach that is often overlooked. Before anything, I'd like to apologise. I was unable to find a trailer for this film that didn't have foreign subtitles. I hope this won't take away too much from your enjoyment. Outside of the Second World War, you will probably struggle to find a war more covered in film than the Vietnam War. From Platoon to Full Metal Jacket, there are far too many classics to name. But for every classic, there is at least one that falls through the cracks. Among these is 2001's Going Back, following a group of Vietnam veterans as they return to Vietnam for the first time, as they are taken around a country they haven't seen in decades. They try to come to terms with their past, come face to face with old enemies, and try to deal with a former, once trusted captain who they believe deliberately called in artillery on them for disobeying his orders. The action in Vietnam is told in flashbacks, and this is one of the few films that shows the fighting for Hue City during the Tet Offensive. The film stars Casper Van Dien of Starship Troopers fame. Strangely, he plays his character both during the war and years later, very badly aged up with some rather dodgy grey hair dye. Don't let the production quality put you off though. The story being told is pretty solid, and had this film had a larger production and a more well-known cast, I feel it would be close to the same league as some of the more iconic films of this era. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Let me know if there are any underrated war films that you know of that you think I should check out. Just put them in the comments below. Feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was 10 underrated war films, and this was a little bit of history.